Well, blessings, friends. Welcome back to High Kadosh Ministries, where holiness is a way of life. And Jesus of Nazareth is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And together God's people say, Hallelujah. Now, our text this morning is going to come out of Genesis chapter 6, and we have a lot to cover this morning. So fasten your seatbelts and let's go. Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Now there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Note that, friends. There were giants. That word giants in the Hebrew is Nephil. Nephilim is where we get that from. And there were giants in the earth in those days and also after those days. When the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. Now, I've always had a problem with this passage, because I understand if men are evil, God is going to destroy them. But why does he destroy the beast and the fowl? Well, the book of 1 Enoch is going to answer that for us. Verse 8, But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. You see, when it says he's perfect in his generations, it literally means that he is genetically pure. We know this because of the Hebrew word used here, tamim, which is Strong's number 8549. And it's the same exact word that the Lord uses in the Bible when he refers to the red heifer that had to be pure. You see that in Numbers 19 verse 2 when it says, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord had commanded, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they bring thee a red heifer without spot. Same word, tamim. So Noah was without spot. He was genetically pure. That's going to play a key role in our conversation this morning, so keep that in mind. Now back to our text in Genesis 6:10. Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Now, keeping what we have just read in mind from the Holy Bible, let's look to the book of 1 Enoch, which we're not claiming to be Holy Scripture, but certainly it is an historical text that offers us much insight into what we've just read. So let's read together Enoch chapter 6, 7, and 8, and then we'll come back and we'll highlight a couple of things. Now it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. And they all answered him and said, Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations. That means offensive words, foul language. Let us bind ourselves by foul language, curses, and offensive words, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together, and bound themselves by mutual curses, foul language, upon it. And they were in all 200, who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual foul language, curses, and offensive words. And these are the names of their leaders: Simeazaz, their leader, Arakiba, Ramil, Kakabil, Tamil, Ramil, Danil, Ezekiel, Barakajul, Asael, Amaros, Beterel, Ananel, Zachiel, Samsapil, Setarel, Turel, Jamjael, and Sariel. These are their chiefs of tens. Chapter 7. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms, and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them, and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds, and beasts, and reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh, and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Chapter 8. And Azazel taught men to make swords, and knives, and shields, and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth, and the art of working them, or fashioning them, and bracelets, and ornaments, and the use of antimony, which is a metal that's used in alloys, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures, which are medicines made from plants. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. Simjaza taught enchantments, and root cuttings. Armoros, the resolving of enchantments. Barakajul taught astrology. Kokabel, the constellations. Ezekiel, the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel, the signs of the earth. Shemziel, the signs of the sun. And Sariel, the course of the moon. And as men perished, they cried, and their cry went up to heaven. Now, as we just read from the book of 1 Enoch, you should have recognized many parallels and correlations with what we read in Genesis chapter 6. But it seems that 1 Enoch fills in some empty spaces that we're not told about in Genesis chapter 6. So let's go back and let's break this down and let's see what's happening here. Now it says in chapter 6, verse 2, the angels, which are the watchers, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after these women that we're told about in Genesis chapter 6. And it says, come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. Now there are many who might have a problem with how angelic beings, divine beings, could have sex with women. But remember, we're told in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. So there could be angels walking around us, and they look exactly like human beings. And if they can take on that form, then surely they take on the full anatomy of that form, and they're able to do things that angels weren't ever intended to do. So these 200 angels make this pact together that they're going to defile the women of earth, and they're going to defile themselves by openly rebelling against God and his eternal plan for men. And we see that they did this on a place called Mount Hermon. We're told that in verse 6. And so if we look into our Bibles into Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 8, it says, we took at that time out of the hand of the 2 kings of the Amorites. Now remember, the Amorites are the people of the giants. We took from them the land that was on this side Jordan, from the river of Arnon unto Mount Hermon. So Mount Hermon is a biblical place. As a matter of fact, many Bible scholars and theologians believe that when Jesus went up on the Mount of Transfiguration, he went up on Mount Hermon to undo what these 200 fallen angels did, and where the divine meets human flesh in the person of Jesus Christ on that mount, many thousand years before, these angels who are divine took a pact to meet with flesh. And so what God has consecrated and ordained as pure and holy, these angels have set out to defile. Now in chapter 7, verse 1, it tells us that they each chose one wife. I find that interesting simply because if they were so set against the things of God, why didn't they take many wives of these women? But it says that they took one wife for each of them. And they taught these women charms and enchantments. That word enchantments there is sorcery. And they taught them the cutting of roots, or how to make potions and drugs from those roots. And they made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants. And it says they became pregnant and bare great giants, some 3,000 ells. Now let's talk about this for just a moment, because if you look up on the internet right now in modern measurements, 3,000 ells is about a half of a mile. And so there's a couple of things that could have happened here. It could have been lost in translation, and we don't have an accurate measurement of what this text should say. It could be that they were actually that big, or it could be that we don't go by modern measurement of what an ell is. We go back to the ancient text to discover what an ancient ell is. For instance, Dr. Neelan translates the 3,000 ells as 300 cubits, which would equal approximately 400 feet. Now that still is far beyond what we can begin to imagine, but we must remember in the book of Revelation, chapter 21 and verse 16, it tells us that the kingdom of heaven is square. The length and the height and the breadth are all equal to one another, and they are 12,000 furlongs. Well, if you look up the measurement for 12,000 furlongs, that's 1,500 miles. So the city of heaven is 1,500 miles square and 1,500 miles high. Now, if you can fathom a structure that is 1,500 miles high, it shouldn't be hard to fathom a man or an angel being or a giant that is 450 feet tall. Or maybe, if our text is accurate, 1.5 miles tall. I personally want to lean to the idea that it's been lost in translation and we don't have what it actually intended to say here. But because the kingdom of heaven and its measurements right out of the Bible are so high, I certainly would not reject the idea of this being accurate. In the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 33, it tells us that the men were so great that they saw that they were like grasshoppers in their sight. And we're told in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, that Og of Bashan was 18 feet tall. And so that you can understand these measurements and get a visual, take a look at this picture. So you can see here that even a 13-foot, 18-foot man is devastating to a normal man and could rip him apart like a rag doll. And so when we stop to consider a man even 30 foot tall, as you saw in the picture, you can understand how, as it tells us, in Enoch 7:4, that the giants turned against men and began to devour them, eat them as snacks, because they had nothing left to eat. Look after, in verse 2 it says they were 3,000 ells, and then it says they consumed all the acquisitions of men. This means all the things that men were producing for themselves to eat. The giants were devastating their crops, their farm animals, and with men so big, obviously their appetites had to have been great. And so when they've consumed everything that men can grow, harvest, and breed, they began to consume men themselves. And in verse 5, we see that they even began to consume one another. It says they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Well, if you flip over to Enoch chapter 10, verse 12, it says, when their sons, speaking of these giants, have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth. So they began to devour one another. But verse 5 begins by saying they began to sin against birds, beasts, and reptiles. This explains why God had to kill every living thing on planet earth. Because if you look up this word here, just as we did with Noah being pure in God's eyes, in other words, he had pure DNA, what they began to do here is they began to corrupt the DNA of these birds, beasts, and reptiles so that they could create larger breeds of them, and they wouldn't have to devour hundreds of small ones. They could eat the larger ones. And as I reminded you yesterday, the men who went into the land of Canaan, the land of the giants, found grapes that were so big they had to carry them on a stick between two men. So if the giants were defiling even the plant life to produce bigger fruit, they also corrupted the birds, the beasts, and the reptiles by trying to alter their DNA. And so God sees that not only mankind's DNA has been corrupted, but even the beasts, the birds, the reptiles, the fish, these 200 angels have taught things that belong only to God. Deuteronomy 29:29 tells us that the secret things belong to God. And so these fallen angels are teaching these things to men, and because of this, they've corrupted the whole earth. And so that's where chapter 8 picks up. They began to teach all these things to the men and women of the world, even when it says in verse 1 that they taught the women the beautifying of the eyelids. This is the origination of prostitution. They taught women these things so that they could lure and seduce men. And so these are evil practices that are being taught to men. They are teaching divination and sorcery and palm reading and the corrupted use of astronomy. We're told in verse 2 of chapter 8, they teach astrology and constellations. They teach the signs of the earth and the signs of the sun, the signs of the moon. And the chapter ends by saying, as men were literally being obliterated by these giants, and it seems that the giants are going to wipe the common man out to rule the earth for themselves, the men cried, and their cry went up to heaven. And we're going to learn tomorrow what God does about that cry. And I would encourage you to go back after this video and either re-watch it, because there was a lot of meat in here, I understand that, but also correlate these chapters out of the book of 1 Enoch to chapter 6 in Genesis, and so that you can see for yourself how they so fitly join together. They don't contradict one another. They complement one another. And they don't even contradict what you would read in the book of Jasher or in the book of Jubilees. They complement one another. And so we'll end there today, friends. I invite you to come back for another dose of spiritual blessing tomorrow. And what I would encourage you to do today is I would encourage you to look at this story. How much effort that these fallen angels went to corrupt men. They would only go to that degree of effort seeing that our souls are so priceless. And that should cause us to want to live even more faithfully before our God and our King. It should cause us to produce better behavior, stronger commitment, more dedication to the things that we read and are taught through the precious Word of God. I know that's what it's doing for me, and I pray that's what it's doing for you, friends. Now, I love you. I pray that your journey will be blessed today. I pray that your eyes will be open. I pray that your heart will be touched and your lips will be full of praise. Now, as Yahweh wills, and until tomorrow, I'll see you on the next video.